This is a poem that was written for Syrian political activist Fatwa Suleiman. One day, a couple of years ago, she and I were walking across one of the bridges over the Seine in Paris, talking in a mishmash of French and Arabic, and we happened to see in the near distance a man whom we both recognized, who was also Syrian, me because I had seen him at a political gathering, and she because she had last seen him making a speech in front of the clock tower in Homs, where she too had spoken and then had been obliged to leave the country because her life was in danger. And this one is a pantoum, and that's what it's called. Said the old woman who barely spoke the language, "Freedom is a dream, and we don't know whose." Said the insurgent who was now in exile, "When I began to write the story, I started bleeding." Freedom is a dream, and we don't know whose. That man I last saw speaking in front of the clock tower when I began to write the story. I started bleeding 5 years after I knew I'd have no more children. That man I last saw speaking in front of the clock tower turned an anonymous corner and disappeared. 5 years after I knew I'd have no more children, my oldest son was called up for the army, turned an anonymous corner, and disappeared. My nephew, my best friend, my second sister, whose oldest son was called up for the army, are looking for work now in other countries. Her nephew, his best friend, his younger sister, a doctor, an actress, an engineer, are looking for work now in other countries, stumbling, disillusioned in a new language. A doctor, an actress, an engineer wrestle with the rudiments of grammar, disillusioned, stumbling in a new language, hating their luck and knowing they are lucky. Wrestling with the rudiments of grammar, the old woman who barely speaks the language hated her luck. "I know that I am lucky," said the insurgent, who is now in exile. And speaking of political activists, this is a poem that's in part for the great American political poet activist Muriel Rukeyser. It's called Crepuscule with Muriel. Instead of a cup of tea, instead of a milk silk whelk of a cup of nearly 6 o'clock tea time, cup of a stumbling block, cup of an afternoon unredeemed by talk, cup of a cut brown loaf, of a slice, a lack of butter, blueberry jam that's almost black. Instead of tannin seeping into the cracks of a pot, the void of an hour seeps out, infects the slit of a cut I haven't the wit to fix with a surgeon's needle threaded with fine gauge silk, as a key would thread the cylinder of a lock. But no key threads the cylinder of the lock. Late afternoon light, transitory, licks the place of the absent cup with its rough tongue, flicks itself out beneath the wheel's revolving spoke. Taut thoughts gone with a blink of attention, slack, a vision of death and distance in the mix. She lost her words, and how did she get them back when the corridor of a day was a lurching deck? The dream life logic encodes in nervous ticks she translated to a syntax which connects intense and unfashionable politics with morning coffee, Hudson sunsets, sex, then the short circuit of the final stroke, the end toward which all lines looped out, then broke. What a gaze out the window interjects. On the southeast corner, a black lab balks, tugged as the light clicks green toward a late day walk by a plump brown girl in a purple anorak. The Bronx-bound local comes rumbling up the tracks out of the tunnel over West Harlem blocks, whose windows gleam on the animal warmth of bricks, rouged by the fluvial light of 6 o'clock. Headaches. Wine again, the downside of any evening's bright exchanges, scribbled with retribution. Stark awake, a tick throbs in the left temple's site of bombardment. Tortured syntax, thorned thoughts, vocabulary like a forest littered with unexploded cluster bombs, no exit except explosion ripping the branches. Stacks of shadowed books on the bedside table wall a jar of tiger balm. You grope for its glass Netsuke hexagon. Tick stabs, dull pain supersedes voices. Stills obsessive one-sided conversations. Turn from mouths you never will kiss, a neck your fingers will not trace to a golden shoulder. Think of your elders. If, in fact, they died, the interlocutors who, alive, recede into incoherence, you would write the elegy, feel clean grief, still asking them questions, though you know it's you who provide the answers. Auden's Old People's Home, Larkin's The Old Fools are what come to mind, not Yeats. In a not-so-distant past, someone poured a glass of wine at 3 a.m, laid a foolscap pad on the kitchen table, mined a spark from the long, loquacious dinner 2 hours behind her. And you got a postcard, a 50s jazz club next day across town, where she'd scrawled she found the tail end of a good Sancerre in the fridge and finished the chapter. Now, she barely knows her friends when you visit. Drill and mallet work on your forehead. Basta. And it is Margaret you mourn for. Get up, go to the bathroom. You take the drugs, synapses buzz and click. You turn the bed lamp on, open a book. Vasoconstrictor and barbiturate make words in oval light reverberate. The sky begins to pale at 6 o'clock. A few years ago, there was a project going on in England where poets were given the lyrics of fado songs, translated from Portuguese, and asked to write poems that were either in some way translations of these lyrics, or simply poems that came out of those lyrics. And I did 3 of these, and they're not at all translations. They take the initial theme or image of the fado song and turned it into another poem. And this one is from a rather famous fado poem called Batonero, Black Boat. If you were there when I woke, with my barbed wire, with my scars, you would avert your green gaze. I would feel the chill of regret, though you said something else in sunlight over wine. I saw a cross on a tall rock, and a black boat danced on light. Someone waved. Was it you? A brown arm between white sails. Old women know that more go away than will ever return, than the morning has scars. In the wind as it blows wet sand against the panes, on the water that sings, in the fire as it dies, in blue sheets warmed by someone sleeping alone, on an empty park bench when they lock up the square, you are still there. brown arm, green gaze, black boat, blown sand, barbed wire. This is a sequence of poems, a short sonnet sequence, in fact, that was written for my friend, a good friend, the painter, Marie-Geneviève Havel, who died this summer. And it's about her. This was written several years before that happened. And it's about her. It's about painting. It's about a lesbian bar that used to be on a street in Paris in the middle of the old Jewish quarter of the Marais, which made for uneasy rubbing of elbows. And so there's a bit of all of that. And Rue des Écouves is the name of the street that the bar is on, which was also a street famous because in one of the buildings on the street, something like 44 families were taken away in on the 16th of July 1942 to the internment camp in the Velodrome d'Hiver, and most of them never came back. And there was also, much more recently on that street, a women's bar called Les Scandaleuses, so it's the rubbing elbows of those things. Rue des Écouves. The street is narrow, and it just extends Rue de Rivoli, Rue des Rosiers, a street from which the children went away, clutching their mothers, looking for their friends on city buses used for other ends, one not yet humid morning in July. Now, kosher butchers coexist with gay boutiques, not gaily. Smooth chic de Thebes hold hands. Small boys with forelocks trail after bearded men. And I have dragged that story in again, and will inevitably next compare the curtains of the creaky balcony smelling of female exile, exhaled prayer with the discreet shutters of the women's bar. Hung on the exposed brown stone of the bar's back wall, words and collage on aquarelle, metaphor, a landscape or a well-traveled sky, thigh, eye with a view of stars, her latest work. A child between two wars, she learned her own vision from the salty squall of Norman winters, learned what she couldn't tell except with brush, chalk, pencil, engraver's stylus and blade, with ink spilled on a stone as the sea spills up and over the stones when the tide comes in. Leather jacket, cap, she stands briefly alone at the bar with a glass of wine, her Celtic moonstone eyes as light and dark as the shapes she made, while the night's first women come in out the rain. The night's first women come in out of the rain, two couples who arrived enlaced astride two motorcycles, pulled up just outside the door, doff, helmets and leather, order gin tonic, beer, a kir. From the bar they crane their necks toward the row of dreams, mindscapes, implied back roads they're too young to have traveled, slide closer together, wanting things to begin. Watching, she doesn't envy them their youth, their way of being in a pack in pairs, wounds inflicted in the name of truth on friends, near infidelities on stairs. But the lacework beginning near that one's mouth is elegant, engraver's grooves, soft dares. The elegant engraver's grooves, soft dares to follow down to the glass-roofed quay, embark on the last train's last car, hurtling through the dark tunnel, irregularly blazed with flares, alizarin, viridian. Lit by the glares, a silhouette, androgynous, at work setting in Paris, London, Prague, New York, mosaic tiles. She leads you up spiral stairs into the blue explosion of the air's matinal brilliance, but she disappears. Avid flesh, mercurial avatar, desire, or imagination sends. And then you know exactly where you are. The street is narrow. You see where it ends. I'm going to read one more ghazal because they're like peanuts. You can't eat just one. And this one was written it was written in Konya in Turkey a couple of years ago, which is where Rumi lived and wrote. And there was an international writers' conference that included people from Turkey, from Iran, from the United States, from Syria, from Germany, from Afghanistan, discussing in various languages the poetry of Rumi, and the ghazal is one of the forms, in fact, that he used. And there was one extremely young woman, extremely young as in 23 or 24 years old, from Afghanistan, whose name was Farkhanda, who, when there was, after this rather academic discussion of the ghazal with people talking in Farsi and the poor simultaneous translators suffering, because they weren't simultaneous translators by profession, they were other people at the conference who just happened to speak Farsi and English. But Farkhanda said, when she was a very small child in Afghanistan, her grandfather and uncles and their friends, also male, used to get together and drink tea and recite ghazals. And because she was a small child and a girl at that, she wasn't allowed to come into the room where they were doing that, but she would sit outside the door and listen to them reciting ghazals out loud and memorize as much as she possibly could, or at least of what they were reciting. And so this poem is, it jumps from one thing to another thing, the way the ghazal does, but it's dedicated to Farkhanda, outside the door. Laughter, music, voices singing verses can be heard outside the door. The little girl is memorizing every word outside the door. Light in the stairwell seen through the Judas hole. Is that the visitor you longed for or you feared outside the door? Long hours in lamplight practicing his scales and counterpoint to solfege of a bird outside the door. The diplomat entering the leader's office forgets the Copt, the communist, the Kurd outside the door. Praise to the leader, loyalty till death. Another imprecation is whispered outside the door. The first love left, the second packs her bags. Are those the nervous footsteps of the third outside the door? Self is a mirror, poster color bright, but notice how the colors become blurred outside the door. The revolutionary's nameless laundress wonders what happens to a dream deferred outside the door. This is a poem written just a few months ago, and I've actually never read it out loud before. And it's also for Fadwa Suleiman, the dedicatee of the first poem, who was diagnosed with an inoperable lung cancer at the age of 46. But it's also really for Fadwa and for everything she did. It's called Calligraphies. While the same rain fell on suburbs of exile and motherless children, whose courage was certainty, whose impatience turned to doubt, she came in the door like a comrade, lover, friend, and took off her shoes. Older than my daughter, but too young to be my sister. Sister of someone who was forced to denounce her on television, pacifist in Kefia, but they got guns anyway. She rolled impatient exilic cigarettes, wrote fables of mourning. The mother tucked the child in her bed and slit the dove's throat. Slit throat, cutthroat sun, slashed wrists of early spring rain. Wolves at a distance give up verse panegyrics and howl like politicians. Is hope a fatal disease, or was that despair? The old woman sheared her gray hair short as a boy's, kneaded wine in dough like clay. Words were clay and wine, what I imagined she knew by heart recited. The boy who'd stood beside her was a killer now, or killed. They bore the cardboard coffin, cardboard clock tower at a crossing of Paris streets where her voice was already losing context. Not to lose contact with what she was would be, she played it on TV, a Lebanese soap about political prisoners. Larger than life, she acts her life while she lives it, keeps writing the script, but not the body's misfires or defections in the blood. Blood in the orchard, or a memory of blood, a song about it. Shepherds in all the stories, treason in most of your dreams. Walk in an orchard where you picked low-hanging fruit or shook down olives in another century's childhood before departures. How old was the child, her son, when she last saw him? Her choice, her story, but it's close to 5 years now. The boy near adolescence, as my daughter was at 12 and a half, 13, in orchards pendant to other hill villages, other declensions of loss. I decline to spool out or wind in someone else's narrative spiral. Don't want that poem to end, cannot know how it began. Lead weights in my legs, because I didn't die young, age caught up with me, a face to frighten children with its own terrified eyes. Own my solitude, its immunocompromised auto-absorption. Write emails in her language, but she isn't answering. Up against the wall, with no windows on the street. Outside my windows, spring drains away through a sky mottled with silvery clouds. Mottled, nacreous throat of the dove at her throat, hope and betrayal in the book to be published, only poems, just paper. The Shabab cheered their Joan of Arc. On YouTube, she preceded herself toward the dovecote of her chest in a suburb of the rain. And I'll read one more poem. Okay, this is this last poem is another glosa for another political dissident, Anna Akhmatova, the great Russian poet. And in this poem, the 4 lines glozed are from Judith Hemschmeyer's translation of Akhmatova's poem Willow. And the speaker of the poem is someone like Akhmatova, who, as most of you might know, during the Stalinist period was forbidden to publish, and so she would write poems, and then she and one friend or another, and very often this was a young widow named Lydia Chupskayeva who wrote a memoir about it. They'd read the poem until they had both memorized it, and they would burn it over the ashtray. So the lines from Akhmatova's poem. And I grew up in patterned tranquility in the cool nursery of the new century. And the voice of man was not dear to me, but the voice of the wind I could understand. A sibilant wind presaged a latish spring. Bare birches leaned and whispered over the gravel path. Only the river ever left. Still, someone would bring back a new sailor middy to wear in the photograph of the four of us. Sit still, stop fidgeting. Like the still leafless trees with their facility for lyric prologue and its gossipy aftermath, I like to make up stories. I like to sing. I was encouraged to cultivate that ability, and I grew up in patterned tranquility. In the single room with a greasy stain like a scar from the gas fire's fumes, when any guest might be a threat, and any threat was a guest from the past or the future, at any hour of the night, I would put the tea things out, though there were scrap leaves of tea, but no sugar, or a lump or two of sugar, but no tea. 2 matches, a hoarded cigarette, my day's page ashed on its bier in a bedsitter. No godmother had presaged such white nights to me in the cool nursery of the young century. The human voice distorted itself in speeches, a rhetoric that locked locks and ticked off losses. Our words were bare as that stand of winter birches, while poetasters sugared the party boss's edicts, the only sugar they could purchase, with servile metaphor and simile. The effects were mortal, however complex the causes. When they beat their child beyond this thin wall, his screeches, wails, and pleas were the gibberish of history, and the voice of man was not dear to me. Men and women, I mean, those high-pitched voices, how I wanted them to shut up. They sound too much like me, little machines for evading choices, little animals selling their minds for touch. The young widow's voice is just hers, as she memorizes the words we read and burn, nights when we read and burn with the words unsaid, hers and mine, as we watch and are watched, and the river reflects what spies. Is the winter trees rustling a code to the winter land? But the voice of the wind I could understand. Thank you.